By the time his Ninth Symphony was performed that night in Vienna, Ludwig van Beethoven was profoundly deaf. Almost 2 centuries later, this music remains as potent, obsessive, and bewilderingly brilliant as ever. It's even more remarkable when you remember that its composer was unable to hear.
For me, the struggle that comes through Beethoven's music is what makes it so compelling. And struggle was always part of his life. Just as with Shakespeare, you come to Beethoven to engage with the big questions that stir nations, that stir humanity itself. The struggle against deafness, the struggle for personal freedom on every level, the determination to be an artist on his own terms. All this I feel acutely in his music. Music which, against the odds, articulates the indomitable power of the human spirit. His music has changed lives. It's changed history. And with him, you might say, music grew up.
Beethoven was born into a family of court musicians in the German city of Bonn.
I don't think his mother meant to neglect them. It wasn't as if they were poor. Certainly not when we were children. But I don't remember it being exactly a happy home.
Keep the tempo even.
A gifted pianist, Beethoven had inherited the talents of his late grandfather, a renowned musician who'd been director of music at the court. Unlike young Ludwig, his father Johann, a tenor and music teacher, had failed to live up to the family name.
Right, that's enough. Stop. Enough. That's enough. How many times do I have to tell you just play the notes in the exercise?
But, Papa, it's so beautiful.
It's silly trash. Stop.
Grandfather would have loved it.
I said enough!
It was bewildering for Ludwig. He never knew what kind of mood his father would be in. And more, he withdrew into himself.
It was clear that Beethoven's talent as a musician might provide an escape from his father. And when he got his first job, aged only 13, as deputy court organist, Beethoven's future suddenly seemed brighter. He began to study the work of Bach, Mozart and Haydn. And it's around this time you can see first evidence of his gift for composing.
Since I was 12, my muse has often whispered to me, "Try and write down the harmonies in your soul." Only 12 years old, I thought. And how would I look as a composer? And what would men experienced in the arts say about it? I was almost shy. But my muse wished it, I obeyed and wrote.
This is a work of astonishing sophistication for such a young composer. In the previous 20 years, sonatas had become the principal benchmark by which piano music was judged, so it says a lot for the young Beethoven's ambition that he was prepared to attempt this form so early on.
At the age of 21, Beethoven left Bonn behind him and set off to seek his fortune in Vienna, the musical capital of Europe. He arrived with an invitation to study with the world's greatest living composer, Joseph Haydn.
And what do you make of that, then?
Well, I would be honored to study with you, Herr Haydn, but you know better than I do that every true artist must find his own path.
Of course. An extraordinary young man. I wasn't surprised at his impatience. After all, I suppose this was a young man in a hurry, and I was a composer in my twilight years. But I sensed that in time he would give the world something to talk about, and I would be proud to call myself his teacher.
Soon after he arrived in Vienna, our father died. I wrote to tell Ludwig, but he didn't come back for the funeral. In fact, he never returned to Bonn.
The death of his father meant that Beethoven could finally put his childhood behind him. Before long, he was being feted in the salons of the Viennese nobility as the city's most exciting newcomer. Nothing could hold him back.
It's novel, and I like it because of its novelty. Others may find it too complex. If I were you, I wouldn't publish this last one just yet. It needs more work. What's wrong with it? No, nothing's wrong with it. I simply meant that this is a complicated work. Absolutely too much so. The public hasn't caught up with you yet. Perhaps they're not quite ready for this. It was a little embarrassing, to say the least. All I meant to say was that the public may not take so readily to such a difficult and stormy finale. But the work was outstanding. It made me proud. And I asked him later if he would put Pupil of Haydn on the piece. It's a normal practice, but not for Beethoven. He refused outright.
perhaps it was necessary for the young composer to carve his own way. He needed to make his work distinct from that of his contemporaries or teachers, like Haydn. And he does that here in the F minor piano sonata, setting himself challenging ground rules in order to express the maximum. Whereas composers like Haydn and Mozart might achieve contrast through key change, Beethoven here sticks pretty much to the one key, F minor. And he forces us to sit up and listen through the use of very clever localized effects. Repetition, strange syncopated rhythms, and extreme shifts between loud and soft. He's taken the idea of contrast to a much higher, more provocative degree.
The feelings he aroused in his teachers were not confined to me alone. He was so stubborn, so bent on having his own way, that many of us had our disagreements with him. He claimed, apparently, that I was jealous of him. But when you heard the work, how could one not feel it had all been worthwhile?
Beethoven's early years in Vienna were characterized by his writing for the piano. And it's in these sonatas, private works intended for domestic and not public consumption, that we see the real masterpieces of his youth. With them, you have a sense that he's discovered his inner voice.
It was his skill as a virtuoso pianist that propelled Beethoven to fame in Vienna. Within just a few years of his arrival, he was already wildly popular as the city's foremost improviser. Contenders would spar in contests where each had to improvise on a well-known piece of music. And to maintain his position, Beethoven had to see off the competition, taking on the heavyweights of the European music scene.
Ladies and gentlemen, Herr Beethoven tonight will meet more than his match, I believe. May I present the brilliant, the hitherto unbeaten, all the way from Paris? But don't hold that against him. He's dexterous, he's dashing, he's debonair, he's Monsieur Daniel Steibelt.
When are you going to start? We haven't got all day.
Absolutely delightful. And now, I introduce the toast of our beloved Vienna. We know him, we love him. His fingerwork is finesse itself. But is he the best? Let's find out. Herr Ludwig van Beethoven!